public's interests are no longer going to be at the forefront. And I think that's what we're seeing in the pandemic is public's interest is later. It's okay if we harm them.
So, Deanna, it's a lovely pleasure to meet you at the Better Way conference. It's a fascinating time to be alive. Tell me a little bit about what brought you here this year and what you came here to share.
Dan, well, thanks for having me. First of all, it's great to have an opportunity to have a conversation. And so I was invited to speak here to participate in the Pharma, finding a better way for the pharma business I think it's pharma business to better health or something along those lines. But so one of the things that we've been researching in Canada with the Canadian COVID Care Alliance is just all the ways that money flowed from global entities, for-profit entities, specifically those who are very interested in vaccines and vaccine business and the vaccine business, and how they basically either flowed their money to certain players within our healthcare system and or used our public funds, our public healthcare funds, and directed them towards their purposes, which is ingenious, right? I mean, if you want to save money and make more profit as a pharmaceutical company, why not use public funds to do the work that you need to do?
And so, advertising for you as well.
Yeah, so, the funds flowed in a lot of really interesting ways. So, for instance, we have an evidence-based process in Canada whereby we have an independent panel called NACI, and they're supposed to examine the evidence for all of the vaccines that are approved in Canada and make the recommendations. And, they basically make recommendations to the Public Health Authority, the National Public Health Authority, which is called PHAC in Canada. And then they make they recommend what should be done, and then each of the provinces follow suit. Interestingly enough, at the World Health Organization conference in February, when they're figuring out how to deal with the pandemic, and there were 4 NGOs present at that conference that had very vaccine-specific agendas, suddenly they created a roadmap out of the pandemic, roadmap forward, and vaccines were at the forefront of that roadmap, surprisingly. And then what they did was Canada signed on to the research priorities that they had outlined in that roadmap called GLOPIT-R, and then funded research according to that roadmap. So the chair of NACI, who's the group that's supposed to be making the recommendations, the evidence-based recommendations for Canada, she received $2.5 million in research funding, when the pandemic started. So she's an infectious disease specialist. And so instead of saying, hey, wait a second, maybe when we look at the population as a whole and we isolate out the long-term care facilities and the people with comorbidities and the elderly, maybe people aren't really at risk of this particular disease. But no, suddenly, yes, COVID is something very serious. We need to lock everybody in their houses and put masks on their faces. So she's gone on to granted $10 million more in research funding. So for me, it makes it very difficult to understand how she could be benefiting so much in her career as a researcher while still remaining objective about these particular products. The co-chair of NACI earned $3.5 million before the vaccines before we knew anything about the safety and efficacy of the vaccine in order to get Canadians ready to receive the vaccine. So again, that's a big payoff. They're not receiving these funds personally. They're institutional grants that they're receiving as principal investigators, but it definitely bolsters their career, and it very well might skew their perspective on how to weigh the evidence.
You can certainly describe it as a conflict of interest. And what we've seen here at the conference is the same similar stories around the world. Mm-hmm. My question to you is this, as someone who's got a long history in evidence-based medicine, is that what I find most peculiar is that we hear these stories over and over and over again, and it seems to have always been normalized. And my intended title for this conversation is Evidence-Based Medicine in a Distorted World, because to me that financial interest, it does distort the evidence-based medicine process. Mm-hmm. So do you think this has been a long, kind of slow-burning problem that's now reached a critical point where more people are now becoming aware, or is this a kind of level that we're seeing during the course of the COVID chapter?
Yeah, well, we've been looking at evidence and looking at conflicts of interest for, 23 years easily, because it's always part of the process. When you see a study, you're supposed to look at, the competing interests and weigh that against what you see in the study when you're reading it properly. But so some of the things that we would normally be looking for is the money coming directly from pharma.
That's right.
Or, Pharma gave them a juicy research position, or they got to be the principal investigator of the next trial, or, something interesting like that. But the thing that I think is really interesting about the COVID moment, it's kind of like, you're used to sitting here looking forward and you've got the front line and you see them coming forward over you. But what's happening here is they're parachuting in behind us. So they're coming in through the institutions that we normally think are good. So for instance, there's a tri-council and they basically give out the funding through the government. And, usually everybody would say, oh, government funding is neutral, right? But if the government is on board and has an agenda and is directing funds specifically towards a specific purpose, then they are part of the conflict of interest. And one of the really interesting things that we learned as we continued to dig, and we're like, why on earth is the government so into this, is we learned that in 2015, our government, formed this economic board. And, they said, can we imagine the future for Canada, the economic future for Canada? And then, from that board, they say, we're going to have 6 growth sectors in Canada, and the health and biosciences sector is going to be one of them. And then they commissioned this other group, which is the health and biosciences economic strategy table. And lo and behold, what that was is a public-private partnership. So they actually invited industry to the table and had industry directing the conversations about how to grow the Canadian economy. So government is inviting industry in and giving them the authority to direct government funds and government and public funds, with the promise, of course, that they're going to, grow the Canadian economy. But we all know that for-profit entities will, take public funds and make profits for themselves.
Yes, and I think over the course of the weekend, we've seen that story play out both in the medical industry, the food industry, various other industries.
Yeah. So this concept of public-private partnerships being the way forward for innovation is basically, think about it, Dan. So if you and I are in a conversation or in an interaction, and you have my full attention, and then all of a sudden I say, what I'm going to do is 10 other interviews at the same time. How much do you get at the end of the day, right? I'm going to do a public-private partnership with 10 other people. What's left for you, the public who's paying the bill, is very, very little. So the more you invite to the table, especially people for-profit entities, and you give them the lead position, there's not going to be, the public's interests are no longer going to be at the forefront. And I think that's what we're seeing in the pandemic is public's interest is later. It's okay if we harm them. What we want to see in Canada and what is described on the Health Canada, on the Canadian Government of Canada websites is the priority is innovation. And, one of the things that they're doing is something called agile regulations in Canada. And so what you normally need to do, is prove that a product, a drug specifically, is both safe and effective and that the benefits outweigh the risks. But they created a back door, and this is for advanced therapeutic products. And advanced therapeutic products, as defined, in the documentation, are things like gene therapy, nanotechnology, 3D bioprinting.
Yes.
And AI-mediated medical devices. So, to me, having built, worked with guidelines, I would say that those are novel, high-risk products. And therefore, they should be subject to the greatest level of testing and scrutiny prior to release, because you want to make sure that you've identified any potential harms that you can risk stratify when you're deploying it, and so that people can make informed choices. But interestingly enough, these health and biosciences economic table, what they recommended is that we need to deregulate. We need to create a backdoor whereby, with a minimum level of evidence, the moment that you can suspect, and I think that the way that they phrase it is something along the lines of, if there is evidence to support the conclusion that the benefits outweigh the risks, then we go to market.
Off we go. Yeah.
We're done. So, if you can imagine nanotechnology, right? It's like they have to present the minimum level of evidence. You don't even have to prove that it's safe anymore. Before the Hippocratic Oath, we would take it under ourselves to test extensively so that we know that we're not doing any harm when we deploy. So what they've suggested is that you approve it, and then we'll just give it to everybody, and then we'll evaluate how much harm is being done, and we'll call that safety testing. And unless they can prove that there's harm, which you can only ever do in a randomized controlled trial, which won't be done because the moment you deploy something, you'll create this, the argument is that if everybody is able to receive that, it's unethical to withhold it from somebody. So they'll shut down the randomized controlled trials, and then you'll never be able to prove harm, so that if you get harmed by the drug, this advanced therapeutic product, then you won't have any position to litigate against the company. So it's a brilliant move. It's basically, letting the fox get in charge of the hen house and tell you the best way to extract the chickens. It's like, oh, wow. But I think most people need to know that these public-private partnerships are happening right across the board, and that they're very dangerous, because what they do is they move from putting the public interests first to letting the corporations run the show, when they always put profits before people. So
so we're in a room full of people who are seeking this information, that they have these concerns and they share these concerns. But the challenge is raising broader awareness around this. So for the people not in the room, why do people need to care about this? Because we can clearly see the implications of this, but how do we open up the broader public's attention to this problem? Because to me, it's going to take wider awareness and to put pressure on this and to change things. You might have a different idea about how we can change this, but what do you think it would take to get public mass awareness of this problem?
Oh my goodness, that's the question of the day, right? So we've got media censorship left, right, and center. Yes. I don't know. I really kind of feel that the truth prevails at the end of the day. And there's something really powerful about speaking the truth. And I think one of the problems here is that the for-profit sector is basically being given the lead position, and then they're going to use people. So I really feel that if you care about people and you're willing to stand up and you're willing to speak regardless of the consequences, that shows a level of care for people that you're not going to see in the for-profit sector. And I think that if we all take up that mantle and look out for each other and speak the truth, that will have a power that media might not be able to stop. And so, I think get informed and then pluck up the courage to speak and engage. I really find that there's quite a bit of mileage. If you speak about COVID, everybody's like, "Oh, stop already! It's over!" Right? So this is the thing. But I've had with people who have had no ability to speak to them about COVID or the vaccines or anything like that. They just don't want to hear anything. When I tell them that their healthcare system is being co-opted by Pharma, and that that they'll soon be able to be putting drugs on the market that aren't proven to be safe, and you won't know any better, they get concerned about that. And so I think that that's definitely an area of dialogue that's easy to have. And I've done a 3-hour long form interview on agile licensing, which I think is something that everybody should learn about. I did it for another podcast. It's called Open Mic, but I can send you the show notes for anybody who wants to have the expanded.
Yes, I mean, we have these 15-minute slots in this conference, and as we're speaking, I've got about 10 questions just for what we've already spoken about. So maybe we can have an extended conversation after the event. But I think you're absolutely right. We'll move from that symptom level. The issues that we've been dealing with, as painful as some of those symptoms have been, around the issues around the COVID and the vaccine story. But when we actually delve deeper into that root cause problem, I think that's where we can actually break down those division, the tribalization and the polarization that comes with that emotive conversation, to come down to a level of recognizing conflicts of interest, corruption, and the consequences of those things. So it's fantastic to have you with us here. This insight into what's happening in Canada, a reflection of what we've seen in the broader world. And hopefully people at home now will start to see that there are much deeper problems here that we must pay attention to. And at the conference here, we're looking at how do we find a better way. And I think it's important we ask those questions moving forward, because the future really is in our hands. And I think that's that's the message of hope I'd like to send. Is there a message of hope you'd like to conclude with?
Well, I'm a firm believer that you need to understand the problem before you can plot out the solution. And so one of the things that we're doing is figuring out who's orchestrating all of this. And I think that, one of the things that I noticed early on, maybe 10 years ago, was that all the best talent in Canada, you'd get to know somebody and you're like, man, that person was really talented. And all of a sudden, 2 months later, they're like, I'm no longer in Canada. I'm with the global blah, 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 global blah, 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 blah. And I was like, man, global blah, 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 blah is huge, first of all. And they've got the best talent.
Right.
And so I think what's kind of really interesting is that there's this global commercial world that has gotten itself organized and populated that is above and beyond the laws of any specific state. And what they've figured out how to do is leverage nation against nation and to infiltrate institutions under various guises. Like they've hired the best talent, the best marketers, the best PR specialists, the best market, whatever it is, scientists. And now I think they've become predators. And I think that it's really important to start to think, whoa, wait a second, it used to serve us and now it wants us to serve them. And until we really recognize that and get organized to start to tame the beast, so to speak, I think we're surprisingly at risk. All of a sudden we wake up one day and it's like, wait a second, you're the master and I'm the servant? What's going on? And so, if we want to change that and if we don't want that to become a thing, then I think that we need to understand what's happening. And, when we're bigger and when we work together and we stay organized and we're honest and caring, then I think that that's very powerful.
Thank you. Knowledge and truth is power. Thank you, Deanna. This has been a wonderful conversation. And thanks for the time you've spent with us and also for your wonderful talk here at the Better Way Conference.
Thank you very much, Dan. Great to talk with you.